Let me begin with a story. About this time last year, I keynoted a large educational conference in New York. And as part of my duties at this conference, I was to moderate an activity known as the Fishbowl. Now that's when people, and in this case, high school students from right across the state, convene in a circle to discuss something. Around them are other people observing, not engaging, but simply observing what's happening inside the fishbowl. At this conference, the outer circle was comprised of school principals. The students, the inner circle, were asked to give their thoughts about diversity and inclusion, and how well or not they figured those efforts were going within their schools. I can tell you firsthand that conference organizers assumed the students would focus on racial diversity, since that was the unspoken definition of diversity that the organizers themselves had. Well, surprise! This mixed bag of students took an entirely different path. They homed in on diversity of thought and the lack of it in their schools. One self-described liberal student said, "I never fear speaking my mind at my school. I know I'll be given a fair hearing, for sure. But I don't think my conservative peers would be given a fair hearing. And I know quite a few who are afraid to say what they truly believe." Another student went further. He said, "I want my friends from conservative families to feel like it's okay to express themselves." At which point, a third student chimed in, "Exactly, I want to learn from them." Whereupon, a fourth student piped up, "Yeah, I don't have all the answers." On and on the conversation went. And by the way, I can assure you that these students are not alone in their sentiments. Studies done by YPulse, America's leading youth research firm, show that so-called Gen Z is hungry to hear all sides of the issues. You know who's not open to allowing various points of view? Us, adults. I'd like to put a pin in that point. I'll come back to it. For now, let me say that these students were doing something significant in real time. They were reimagining what a safe space looks like. They don't want safe spaces to mean romper rooms in which, they're shielded from dissenting opinions. To them, that's just a boring space, and an unjust one. What they mean by safe space is one that's safe precisely for people to disagree, and to disagree without being immediately judged. Think of this as civic diversity. It's the kind of diversity that cultivates unity, because everybody trusts that they'll get a say. And it's unity without uniformity, since everybody could have something different and unique to say. Civic diversity is the kind that celebrates individuality, since nobody is reduced to a token of this or that group. Yet it's individuality without the selfishness of individualism. Above all, by clearing room for various points of view, civic diversity avoids inflaming the culture wars. Why should the kind of diversity that we teach in America avoid inflaming the culture wars? Here's why. Because the stakes are too high to continue fanning those flames. You see, the generation that we're teaching today will be responsible for contributing to, and maybe even coming up with, lasting solutions to challenges that have become existential to this republic. Big tech and their algorithms that manipulate Americans left, right, and center. Big media and their agendas that make us feel more divided than we need to be. Big corporations, inhabited, to be sure, by decent people, but people who are caught in a set of rules that convey, if the price of progress is the death of the American dream, so be it. All of which drives a huge swath of the country to demand that big government step in with solutions. But solutions can't be enduring if they're imposed. Being imposed upon ripens any side of a debate to think of itself as being humiliated, which makes it easier for demagogues left and right to whip up backlash. And so the needle of national repair does not move. All that moves is the hamster wheel of us against them. Not us and them. I mean, there will always be different positions in matters of massive import. I'm talking about us against them, the demonizing of our others. And as the hamster wheel of us against them rotates, the noise amplifies, the cynicism deepens, and the will to keep our republic diminishes. That's what we need to turn around. And that's why I believe education today must include teaching a new generation, as well as ourselves, how to communicate across lines of disagreement, which in turn means teaching the skills of moral courage. As you can see from the slide, moral courage means doing the right thing in the face of fear. I'll get to the bit about the right thing in just a moment. First, though, let me speak to the fear. Behavioral science consistently shows that what we human beings fear more than anything else is judgment, negative judgment, being shamed and blamed, being thought weak, ignorant, or incorrect in any way by those whose respect we covet. And so, in any given situation, most of us will just go with the flow, instead of exposing ourselves to different points of view that could clarify and, yes, challenge whether we are, in fact, doing the right thing. Proactively seeking different points of view is exactly what the framers did when drafting and ratifying the Constitution. Now, I'm not saying that you and I need to found a new republic, not at all. But we do need to revive the spirit of the republic we've inherited. Groupthink is the opposite of this spirit. Let me give you an example of how insidious groupthink is, how it can undermine the integrity even of those who believe themselves to be inclusive. Follow me back to the fishbowl. I mentioned that in the first half or so of the fishbowl, students focused on the absence of viewpoint diversity in their schools. Eventually, though, they did make their way to diversity of demographics, and that's when one student said, "You know, in all the years that I've been attending my school, from kindergarten right through the 12th grade, we haven't had a single teacher with a visible disability. And that's our loss, because I at least would love to know how the world looks through that person's eyes." The conversation continued in this vein for a few more minutes. Then the students vacated the fishbowl, and into the inner circle came those who'd been observing, namely school principals. They were asked to reflect on what they'd heard. The first principal who spoke wept. She wept. She said that she'd been attending conferences about diversity, equity, and inclusion for 2 decades. She'd heard a lot about race. She'd heard a fair amount about gender and sexual identity. Lately, she'd been hearing about economic class, too. But never until now had anybody brought up people with disabilities. For her, people with disabilities matter. Turns out, she's the head of a school that serves children with special needs. In shattering a silence, you know what that moment did? It revealed groupthink. When educators, like those conference organizers, assume that race equals diversity, they're not teaching justice. They're teaching just us. Diversity as a fishbowl, an inner circle, where certain students get to be heard, but everyone outside of the inner circle only gets to watch, quietly. That's no way to foster unity, because it's no way to build trust. This is why I remind adults that moral courage isn't merely for young people. We, as professionals, need to face our fears of busting out of our fishbowls to encounter points of view that could challenge and thus clarify whether we're doing and teaching the right thing. Otherwise, we'll be imposing our blinders on a new generation, with that hamster wheel rotating. As a nation, we'll be going in circles. The good news is, moral courage is not some inherent virtue. It's a set of skills, and consequently, it can be taught. And it can be learned. Here's the proof. Recently, a former student of mine applied the skills of moral courage to a situation in her own life. Now, her name is Genesis, and she lives in the South. She's vocally opposed to the Confederate battle flag. She was scrolling through her social media feeds and happened upon a comment from Lewis, a guy she remembered from kindergarten, but whom she hadn't spoken with in 25 years. Lewis let her know that he supported the Confederate flag. Instead of labeling him evil or racist, instead of calling him out, Genesis chose to call him in. She invited Lewis to her backyard to sit down over a beverage and discuss the issue. The first question she asked him was this.
So when you see the state flag, Mississippi state flag, how does it make you feel?
It's definitely a symbol of, home. What about you?
Makes me feel unwelcome.
And the conversation began in earnest. They didn't obsess with feelings. Starting that way got the conversation off on a non-gotcha note. But they quickly transitioned to their interpretations of history, their appreciation of doing, not just dreaming, about a better future, and their commitment to building their shared region of America, and America itself. During that discussion, Lewis had an epiphany that he cared more about Genesis than he did about the Confederate flag. What? Why? How did that happen? I asked Lewis afterwards. Because, he said, unlike any other opponent of the Confederate flag, at least any that he'd come across, Genesis gave him the respect of engaging with him. Respect made all the difference. Now, here's the thing. Respect doesn't mean to agree with or be agreed with. The word respect comes from the Latin respectate. Notice that I'm pointing to my glasses. Respectate, to look again. Don't settle for the first impressions that we have of each other based on the labels that we give to one another. Instead, move beyond labels. Ask questions that are sincere. When listening to the responses, listen to understand, not to win. And ask more questions, driven by what you've heard, not driven by some preconceived agenda that you may be harboring as you enter that conversation. All of which brings us to the underlying social-emotional skill of moral courage, transforming disagreement into an opportunity for further engagement. By applying that skill, Genesis wound up mentoring Lewis to pick it up and practice some of it himself. This is why he reciprocated her question, how does the flag make you feel? He demonstrated the skill of stepping back for the sake of humility, not just stepping up for the sake of honesty. The skill, therefore, of role modeling public listening as much as public speaking. And ultimately, the skill to determine whether or when to walk away. Notice that what I'm describing here is an experiential approach to teaching civics. It's obvious by now that the teaching of civics has to be restored. But the way we teach it needs to change. Yes, Learning American history is crucial, and it's vibrant when it's learned from multiple points of view. And yes, appreciating how our institutions work is vital, so we know what to expect of those institutions, as well as prevent them from decaying. But if all we're doing is transmitting information, well, then students don't really need us. They've got the internet, as well as the dangers that go with its rabbit holes. The great opportunity before us is to teach civics in a way that algorithms simply can't, by equipping students with the ability to humanize themselves to their others, their ideological others, religious others, and so forth, and to do so with participatory, immersive, meaningful methods, gamification, role play. Think of it as martial arts for relationship building. This is about teaching not only the what of keeping our republic, the what being civic diversity, but at least as vital, the how of keeping our republic, moral courage.
Aha!